So I might just ask a couple of brief questions, conscious of time, and then we'll go to the floor. I wanted to start with you, Michael. You've been covering the Australian economy for a very long time, and you obviously look at all sorts of indicators in terms of consumer confidence and all sorts of things about how people's behaviour is playing out financially. Were you surprised by the results in our survey, and how did you kind of interpret them from an economic perspective?
Oh, look, I mean, I can see a lot of overlap between those kind of global issues. I mean, that kind of elephant curve story, I think, is clearly playing out in Australia as well. So a lot of the results, I think, are kind of exactly what you would have expected given that backdrop. But there were some, I thought, that did look a little odd, or at least relative to my own perception. So I think you highlighted the travel time one. Absolutely. I would think that's odd. But the one that really stood out was that most people would welcome new technology to help them in their job, where I would have, if you'd asked me the question, I would have said most people are worried that some machine's going to take over their job, or at the very least is kind of keeping a lid on what kind of wage increase and so on they could expect. So I think that was quite a kind of a striking result relative to what I would have thought most people would have answered on that one. I would note, for example, I kind of thought my job was pretty secure from that technology perspective. But the Swiss bank UBS now have a virtual chief economist. So if you can do that, then anything is possible, I guess. I assure you that hashtag it's the real me. But I guess it shows you in a sense that no job is really safe in the evolving environment that we have now. But equally, though, if we want to boost productivity, and in the end, that's really the only way the income story in Australia is going to change, then the new technology is clearly a big opportunity there to pursue that.
Yep. So, one of the interesting things, and I've kind of been discussing this with a few people within government agencies, is we've often had this expectation that as we became wealthier as a country, that our kind of expectations of government would reduce somewhat. But it seems that the opposite has happened, and part of the mentality is, well, we are a rich country, we should be able to afford certain services and supports. How does the public sector respond to this, and particularly in terms of preparing the workforce to deal with constantly changing expectations, but also increasing expectations?
It's probably quite a complex issue to kind of answer. I think that the community will always expect, services from government. I think the survey kind of highlighted something to me, that the gap was getting bigger. So in fact, have the most disadvantaged gained anything? And if not, and if that group is growing, and even middle income earners are feeling the pinch, then I think inevitably you'll find that they'll be looking for services in government. And I saw health sort of being at the top of the list there. And I think people should expect to get those services. I think the challenge for government is that we can't deliver those services in the way we've done in the past. And we haven't thought about the lifelong journey of whether someone presents themselves to a hospital because it's an emergency, because we don't have the mental health facilities somewhere else, because they're ageing and they don't have the support networks around them to leave hospital, and we have to use a hotel across the road. So it's about actually knowing what other things we need in place to actually not put the pressure on those services and to have them there for a particular purpose. And I think that's where technology and actually other ways of doing work can actually help us, so we can actually then use our human element to actually help the most vulnerable and add value to their sort of services. So I think technology could help us change things. We need data to tell us what it is that citizens are actually wanting, and I don't think we're asking them enough about what they're looking for in government services, and it has to shift quite significantly. I think I only need to say NDIS and the impact that will actually have, and are we ready for it? It's a great opportunity, but how ready are we for it, and does government lead the way, or do we do this together?
One thing that you spoke about was undertaking surveys of the workforce. I noticed that the Commonwealth Prime Minister and Cabinet are now going to do citizen surveys and sort of testing both people's expectations of government, but also over time building a kind of database around performance. Will state governments be watching that very carefully?
Well, I think individual agencies probably do customer satisfaction surveys. And they watch what's happening with their particular area. I think it's a great idea to actually do a citizen satisfaction survey, but we actually haven't asked our own people how they're feeling and working in the organisation. I think for me it's a very good first step where you need to work out what the sentiment is of your workforce. Do you have the right people in the right place? Workforce becomes a very significant issue. And at the same time or down the track, I think we absolutely need to get citizen sort of satisfaction. You just need to be clear about what it is that we're measuring and how you get sort of a cross-section of all the stakeholders and business as well in terms of how this works. We are a big beast. And we have to make sure that it pulls all the right levers, whether it's for business investment, how we reform that sector and the social services bit as well. So I agree, but we haven't even asked our staff, and I think it's a good first step.
Yep. And Michael, I just might turn to you for a second before I go to the audience. This also has a fiscal element to it, obviously, and we saw that in parts of the survey where obviously there are these significant expectations, but people also placed importance on personal tax cuts, for example. Based on the current fiscal position, particularly at the Commonwealth level, do you think that there's a point coming where we are going to have to really face into those trade-offs and be quite transparent and explicit about the revenue versus expenditure equation, particularly if we're trying to pay down debt and get back into surplus?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, the trouble we've got at the moment is we're kind of torn in two ways. And there's some short-term things we want to do that we need to do, and then there's those kind of longer-term things happening in the background. And how do you square the circle here? Well, I think the infrastructure push that we're seeing now is actually something that's going to help in both dimensions. So. Why do economists like infrastructure? Well, it's great in the short term because it generates jobs and economic activity. Over the medium term, though, it boosts productivity and incomes. And it's that kind of tax base, if you like, that we really need to keep growing, because we know the demographics are working against us as they are in every country. We're kind of better placed in the sense that we reach the point of pain later than most other countries, but you've only got to look at Japan, I think, as an example about where we all end up. In a way, what are the two sources of growth? Well, it's really two things. You either have more people, or the people you've got spend more. Trouble is, as populations age, they start to shrink. That's happening in Japan. And as people get older, they spend less. That DVD player you bought last year still works. Why do you need a new one this year? So you eventually lose your sources of growth. But if you go to Japan, the place looks quite prosperous. It seems to be doing okay, despite the fact it's not really growing. Why is that? Because when they hit that point, it was at a high level of income, and it's kind of been a manageable decline in a sense. But if you hit that point at a low level of income, it's going to be a much more painful process for everybody. And that's I guess the kind of medium-term story that we should really be thinking about, as much as trying to stimulate the economy right now through tax cuts and the like.
Thanks, Michael. We might go for questions from the floor.
Michael Tellis. I just, on all of the stuff that's been put up, and thank you very much for the great summaries, it's very, very handy. There's no mention of an entrepreneurial spirit. And at a CEDA function earlier this year, Bernard Salt talked about the difference in the growth engine. So picking up on Michael's comment as where does growth come from? So in the US, the top 5 companies are less than 50 years old. In Australia, the top 5 companies are more than 100 years old. That sounds like a big gap. We have a lot of entrepreneurs, 50% of them are related to the building trade, and we know Australia has an absolute addiction to property. But where do you get the real entrepreneurial growth that creates the Googles and the other, the Facebooks and all those new age businesses that'll generate the growth?
Not sure if it's government, but I'd like to think it is. I'd just like to make a comment, I guess, on our Premier's vision in particular for what is now Lot 14, but the old RA. We are stimulating, I think, a lot of energy around creating an entrepreneurial hub there. And Mark could probably talk more about that on my table because his department's actually working through that. But we have got sort of an advisory group that are outside of government that actually are looking at how we can actually do exactly what you've talked about. My area is how do you get that entrepreneur, we're calling it entrepreneurship, in the public sector. So how do you actually spark, I guess, change and innovation in what are very old institutional arrangements? And I think that's where we could get some of the biggest changes occurring when people can disrupt really old institutions and old ways of doing things. So I think there's some really exciting things happening in the state at the moment where a lot of that's actually being stimulated, and I think South Australia is actually a great place to do it. We're small enough and we're agile enough, but government, I guess, in a way has to get out of the way when things are happening, and then if it needs government input, we can try and be agile enough to actually move when we get the Googles or others giving us advice about how we might do things differently. So I'd say watch this space. I think there's some great stuff happening at the moment.
Look, I'd add in the sense, we know what to do. We just kind of got to get on and do it. In a sense, I think Malcolm Turnbull, when he took over as Prime Minister, one of his ideas, he wanted to be the innovation Prime Minister, and we had an innovation statement, but who's heard anything about it since then? So we kind of knew what we had to do, and I thought one of the very interesting points that he made in that statement was, well, we should be prepared to make mistakes. Not every idea is going to become the next Google, if you like. But we have, I think, a very sort of short-term focus in Australia. It's all about, what's my profit statement going to look like in the next quarterly update. So we don't have that same sort of tolerance for making mistakes that we probably need to have. Reserve Bank talks about this a lot, but they term it more as the lack of animal spirits, as they put it. And you can see this playing out across the broader economic story. So we've got this tourism boom underway in Australia right now, and because of that, we are actually building more hotels. But it's kind of reactive. We're building them because the demand's there. We're not building them in anticipation or trying to generate an even bigger tourism industry, is one example. So it doesn't have to be all the very kind of high-tech side of things. There are plenty kind of what are really kind of normal economic opportunities there that we're not really taking advantage of. And what I find particularly concerning at the moment is if we look at growth in the number of new company registrations or ABN numbers as they're being issued, well, they're actually falling at the moment, despite what's a very good economic backdrop. We're not seeing that appetite there amongst potential entrepreneurs to set up new companies and pursue new ideas. So it tells you kind of really need a major sort of shift in thinking, and that's very hard to achieve. I've seen that table that Bernard Salt puts together. In fact, I borrowed it and used it in my presentation a few times. It's a fantastic illustration of the problem we have. If the version I've been using at the top 10 companies, well, the last edition of the top 10 companies in Australia was Woolworths in 1923. That's kind of tells you the problem that we're facing here.
I'd just add one point. So clearly in our survey, the areas where we talked about innovation or innovative jobs didn't necessarily resonate. But I agree with Michael in terms of getting on and doing things. And I'm a little bit optimistic about the younger generation on this, and some of the things that I see groups like the Foundation for Young Australians doing in terms of encouraging social entrepreneurs and people having those skills very early on in their life and being encouraged to develop them. So I think it's still going to take some time in terms of those generations, but I think that's a really good place to start as well in terms of the future.
I think it's me, Anne Edwards. I'm a sociologist. What I found interesting is the multiple layers on which these issues that you've all three been addressing can be viewed, but also the inconsistencies between those. So you started at the beginning with reference to what is clearly identified across Western democracies, which is a significant minority of the population, which is increasingly disenchanted by the decisions that are made at macro levels, because they don't translate to what they would expect to be benefits at their level. And then when you look at the pulse, you've got this rather extraordinary disjunction between the views about their economic, their quality of life in terms of the rewards that they get from their employment not increasing, and hence, or maybe it's separately, putting more and more emphasis on what governments can deliver in terms of quality of services, and I think those two could well be related. But my question really is that we've got macroeconomics and macro politics, if we can call it that, who are talking one language and talking about solutions at one level, which doesn't translate at all into the understandings and the lives of their populations. And I don't think this is a marketing problem. I think it's much more fundamental than that. And I'd just be interested to know how all three of you think we might try to bridge that gap.
John.
Start with you,
Look, it's a very good point. I think there is a big gap between perception and reality. So we do our own surveys at the CBA of our household customers every month, and what comes through very clearly is, of course, they're very well aware of the amount of debt they will have on their balance sheets at the moment. They're very well aware the wages are only growing slowly, if at all. They get alarmed about the talk about potential rises in interest rates at some point. They're still very worried about their job security, and they don't believe the inflation story in Australia because they can point to a whole list of items such as electricity, where there's been huge increases at a time again where their salaries have been adjusting to reflect that. So not surprisingly, they all see their financial position as deteriorating on the back of that. If I look at the reality of what I'm seeing on the Commonwealth Bank's books, well, we see things like, for example, the average home loan borrower is ahead in their repayments by 33 months. Now, that's hard to kind of square with this idea that you're going backwards in a financial sense. We look at the labour market, well, 5.4%, we're not far above that 5% that most people think of as full employment for Australia. So there is a gap, I think, between perception and reality here. But as other people point out, perception is reality in a sense. But how you change people's views, I guess, is really the question. And there's clearly no easy answer to that, I think. So it's a bit of a cop-out. But
maybe I'll talk about it from a grassroots level and my own experiences. Over the last 4 years, I've done all the negotiations for wage increases, and I'm sure people have views about public service wages, but they've been really robust in terms of people not feeling secure, an increase in the casualisation of the workforce. The profile of our worker is a lot older, and unless we drive, I guess, youth employment and ways of getting people sort of in a more ongoing work, I hear a lot about people's inability to buy a house, inability to make commitments in their life. So there is certainly the reality for me, and when I look at people working in the public sector and the sort of people that present at hospitals or the services for NDIS, or people that are losing their job because the services are changing, it's been quite significant. And I've had a fairly lengthy career, and I've never seen, I guess, this scale of change for workers. So where they might on the books be okay, the perception for them is that if they don't save that money, they're not sure that they'll have a job later down the track. And in the 800 youth employment program that we had, it was really half of them have been in multi-generational families where no one's worked. And we've broken that with a few of them. So I've actually seen the other end of it, where people do feel disenfranchised, who don't earn enough, can't buy a house, and rely on government. And they can be the workers, but they're the people that we serve as well. So my experience has actually, it resonated with me, the outcomes of what people were saying. It might look different, but certainly people are worried and concerned about that job security, and I guess they're looking to the public sector because it does actually give them that sort of safety net around how you negotiate their conditions of employment, because I saw that in the survey, and are they eroded when times are rough or whatever. So certainly the reality for me is I've seen some really interesting things over the last 2 or 3 years for not only the workers but people that have been unemployed for a really long time.
So I've reflected on this question, having been involved in the survey, but also thinking about what it sort of means for economists and the economics profession. And interestingly, the chief economist of the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, talks about economics having a twin deficits problem. It's got a deficit of trust and a deficit of understanding at the current time. And so one of the things the Bank of England is doing is actually running town halls and doing a lot more consultation right throughout the country and seeking to understand what's on households' minds. And part of that is both their understanding of the economy right from the ground up, but also building their credibility and trust that the public has in them. So my reflection on that is that I think that sometimes we forget in economics that it's fundamentally about people, and that in the analysis of trends that we're doing, and also when we're working on policy within government as economists, we have to keep remembering that this is about people and getting to that individual level and how you make people's lives better.
And I think what your survey also shows is the standard economic measures like GDP that we all focus on is only kind of getting part of the story. It's far more than just economic growth these days that drives how people feel, I suppose.
Yep. Question over here.
John Newton, Principal of Scotch College. 27 years of extraordinary performance from the Australian economy. I'm British. I doubt very much our economy will look like that in 27 years' time at the current rate of progress. Interesting on your survey, Jared, that education doesn't feature as a priority. Private education as a non-priority. That's a sobering thought for a school principal like me. But education isn't valued. And yet education is potentially the way of helping those people who feel disenfranchised and maybe don't feel they're doing as well as other people are relative to the prosperity they see around them. Education is the way out of that. Is education doing enough to create change in the phenomena that you're describing today?
So in the areas of education where, and we had some in there about TAFE and clear employment opportunities, when it was linked to employment, people tended to rank it higher, whereas some of the formal parts of the education system, they didn't seem to place as much importance as I thought they would have. So I think there is a challenge there for us, and it's partly linking just what does education do in terms of these future employment opportunities, because clearly that is something that resonates in the survey. So I absolutely think we've got a massive challenge. Our inequality report that we did, that I know you're familiar with, at the start of the year looked at these issues, and it has to be one of the biggest change agents in terms of people's future and future opportunities. So absolutely agree. I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but one of the things is to really think about how we talk about the links to future opportunities.
The Reserve Bank has published a very interesting analysis where they've broken down jobs growth, not by industry sector or part-time, full-time, or anything like that, but by the kind of skill level you need for that particular type of job. And what it shows is that all the job losses in Australia over the last 10 years have come out of what they call the routine manual side of things. So I guess these are the jobs that are easiest to automate and the like. All the jobs growth has been in what they call the non-routine cognitive part of the story. So in a sense, if we want people to get jobs, if we want this kind of job security story to become less relevant, then the right education, the right training is critical. And one of the criticisms of economists is that we talk about infrastructure, as I did, but we always just kind of think of it in terms of physical infrastructure, building new roads and railways and the like. But that kind of human capital side of things is going to be just important, if not more important, in the end of the day.
The only comment I'd make, John, is education doing enough to kind of disrupt itself as well? And I know that we've talked about that, and I think it's absolutely the most critical factor. And the disadvantaged youth, when we did get them into the traineeships, the first thing we tried to do is get them back to get some further education and training or university. So I think it's a question back to the educators and the leaders in the education sphere to say, look, how can we get a different narrative for education? Because I think I think that'll get you out of poverty. I think it's absolutely critical. We just don't seem to have it on the agenda as much as we should.
We've got a question over here.
I'm Craig Fowler. The segue into jobs growth is an interesting one, and I was just wondering, Michael and Jared, whether you had information associated with the jobs growth in Australia, say from 2000 onwards, which are jobs created purely and wholly within the private sector versus jobs created that are in fact either fully funded by government or partly at least fuelled by government policy. Because in an era where governments are running major debts and deficits, the growth appears to be in jobs which have an underpinning by government or tax resources. Surely there comes, I'm testing the question, does there come a point where jobs growth fails because in fact we get ourselves deeper and deeper into a deficit? I mean, you can either say South Australia has 1 in 8 people employed in the public sector, that's good, or you could actually say I'm horrified by that number because that's way too many and we'd prefer a proportion, not a smaller public sector necessarily, but a proportion of people which were much more employed in the private sector. I mean, that's where the state needs to go. I'm concerned that the growth is not occurring outside of, in effect, government stimulus one way or another.
To be honest, I'm not sure the exact numbers, but the fundamental point, I guess, is that government is a big share of economic activity across Australia. So it's going to be a big share of the labour market as well, reflecting that. If we look at where the jobs growth has been over the last few years, it hasn't really been in the government sector as such. It's been more in the service-related parts of the Australian economy, and they've been the stronger parts of the economy. So I think you're always going to see some sort of connect there between where we are in the economic cycle, which sectors are going ahead, which ones aren't. The other issue that I think you're referring to here is, well, is a job in the public sector as productive as one in the private sector? That's a harder question to answer because it's hard to measure productivity in some of those public-related sectors in particular. We tried at the Reserve Bank when I worked there, and I suggested number of sheets of paper used on the printer. It would be one good way of measuring productivity because that's what we did. We produced research and printed it off, but it gives you an idea of just how hard it is to say whether this person sitting here in a public sector job are they a bigger contributor to growth or a lesser contributor to growth than the economy than somebody who is perhaps working in a I was going to say car plant, but we don't have those anymore. But somewhere it's much easier to measure productivity. So you've got a measurement problem there that says I think you shouldn't entirely kind of write off the public sector as a drag on the overall story.
I don't have any data with me, but and it's been a while since I've looked at this question, but I know that it was very strong there for a time. I think there's also got to separate out some of the cyclical versus structural factors. So clearly NDIS has played a role in terms of the ramp up of those services in recent years and will continue to do so. Health is about 10%. We spend about 10% of GDP on health, and frankly, when I've looked at this issue, I find it hard to see that is going to go anywhere but up. So that pressure is going to continue. Aged care, another one where I think all of these jobs are growing quite strongly in terms of demand. And I think Michael's picked up on the productivity point. Some of these areas over time, there will be more technology and capital will come into them, and those jobs will change. But they're really important jobs in terms of also picking up on your point, Michael, around non-cognitive skills and the skills that are going to be really important in the future around empathy and different things like that. You know, I think let's keep watching the numbers and the developments in those sectors and see where it ends up. That's time, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.